Well, here we are with Psalm 11, today's Psalm. I'm pretty sure, like all of us, Psalms have been there for me. Bedtimes, early mornings, anxious moments, hard days in the office, deeply distressing times with the family. Over 4 decades, Psalms have been a strength, a comfort. They've recharged my batteries, they've filled my sails, they've soothed my soul. And let me ask you then for a moment, what do Psalms mean to you? If you're bored or stuck with your devotions and you want to read something, where do you and I instinctively go? If you're going through tears or joy, pain or praise, triumph or tragedy, and you want to turn to God or you want to find some authentic goodness, and be encouraged by authentic faith lived out, where do we turn? And the answer has to be Psalms. Over the millennia, Psalms has been the go to poetry, praise positioning, faith posturing, presence of God acquiring experience. And as I'm sure you know by now, there were multiple authors, and I'm sure you also know those authors include David, Solomon, Asaph, the prophetic singers, and Moses. And today's psalm, of course, is a psalm of David. And just before we delve into this particular chapter, the book of Psalms reminds me. Psalms reminds me I'm not on my own. Psalms reminds me that every experience in life that I ever encounter, or the experiences of those around me ever encounter, they're not unique. They've been experienced over the millennia, time and time and time again, and always with a faithful God as the undergirding platform. And yes, that includes COVID, Brexit, international upheaval, and the rest. Underneath are the everlasting arms. He does hem me in behind and before. I really do shelter in the shadow of his wings. That's the practical, ever relevant poetry that the Psalms gives us. It's so easy to find relevance, resonance, and reassurance. So into today's psalm then. It's a psalm of David. And when I say King David, who do you see? I wonder right now what image is in your mind. I wonder what you're thinking of. Now, it will vary. Each of us will have our own emphases, but many will see him as royal warrior, successful battle commander. He was Israel's greatest king ever, so much so that even today, El Al, the airline from Israel, calls first class King David class. Battle-hardened men, not easily swayed or impressed, followed him into danger, commonly found doing hugely heroic exploits because of David's great strength of character, great strength of gifting, and great strength of leadership. And yet the David that was all those things was the friend of God, the shepherd boy who learned to play his harp with outstanding skill on the hills, and whose songs were composed then and later in life with the passion of the heart and a humility of acknowledging troubling and triumphant circumstances. Songs then that reflected the best of times and the worst of times. So these psalms that most commonly, unfortunately, we just read are songs set to music, not sterile theological reflections. They are passionate, praise-filled poetry, or as the Passion Translation calls it, poetry on fire. These songs then were meant to be sung, and the music of them was meant to be heard. Little wonder then that today's psalm is called a song of the steadfast for the pure and shining one. A song of the steadfast for the pure and shining one. That's praise from someone who's learnt to be steadfast in the middle of conflicting experiences and turbulent times. And in this short song, Song 11, we see two halves kind of split into two. There's part one where everything's in turmoil and turbulence around the poet. The advice is to flee, fly away like a bird, hide in the mountains for safety. But even before he takes us there, verse 1 in the Passion Version tells us where his steadfastness is rooted. My faith shelters my soul continually in Yahweh. Now, isn't COVID and our current experience just like that? Most of us actually right now long to fly away, don't we? Most of us in the UK long to fly away to somewhere warm and quiet, somewhere, by the way, that reassures us COVID is conquered and normality is returning, that life, holiday life, travel has been restored. Ryanair knew this. They ran an ad called Jab and Go, and they got slapped on the advertising wrist for doing it. Now, of course, what they were doing was tapping into the longing to fly away. Now, regardless of whether that describes you perfectly or not, what does happen for us all, I'm sure, is that we experience this sense of turbulence, shadows, darkness, that verse 2 puts it here. Can't you see them hiding in their place of darkness and shadows? They're set against all those who live upright lives. It's an enemy that's prepared a trap for us. Even our top pundits, Van Dam, Professor Whitty, and many others describe COVID as an enemy, mutating intelligently to get the better of us. New variants, non-compliant people, refusing masks, refusing to social distance. It feels so agitatingly unsafe. Things seem to be set against those who live upright lives. This wicked COVID disease seems to have a destructive mindset of its own set against us. We can't even meet as church. The scripture here says in verse 3, what can the righteous accomplish when truth's pillars are destroyed and law and order collapse? We're so constricted, so constrained, so apparently hammered by the darkness of this enemy, we can't even meet as church. When truth's pillars are destroyed, law and order collapse. That's quite a statement, isn't it? It's not an absolute. But even that is so resonant with our experience. The overarching sense or angst of this has hung over our international heads in recent months. In America, we've seen law and order collapse, and that's what February's impeachment process reflected back to us. In Myanmar and Russia, we've seen democracy challenged, and alongside the turbulence of COVID is this unsettling sense that somehow the very pillars of what is normal, the very pillars of society as we know it, are so fragile, and a number have started to crumble. Isn't it interesting that the shepherd, warrior, king, friend of God understands all these feelings and more? We don't actually know for sure where this psalm was written, nor are we certain of its context. Many theologians think it was during Saul's mental instability, the emotional, evil, psychopathic, demonic turbulence in Saul, where actually for David the thing to be safe would be to flee, to get away from it all. But then, having articulated all this turbulence, having articulated all the things that were going wrong, and expressing helpfully for us all the darkness and shadows that were pressing in, the second half of this magnificent psalm is called the answer of faith. Yahweh, in verse 4 it says, is never shaken. He is still found in his temple. And what is Yahweh doing? We're about to see. The poet in David is bursting with confidence, bursting with the answer, almost like he's desperate for you and me to see the answer, to hear the answer, and maybe even with him to sing the answer. What is Yahweh doing? He is reigning as King Yahweh over all. And in case we're not quite there, Let me say it again. He's reigning over all. Hear it, sing it. Let it settle into your COVID-assailed soul. He is reigning over all. And yes, you heard it right the first time. Over all. He closely watches and examines everything man does with a glance, the scripture says. His eyes examine every heart. Why? Here it comes again in verse 4, because his heavenly rule will prevail over all. This psalm reminds us then that in the midst of turbulence, we don't minimize it, we don't pretend it's not happening, and when we're all longing to fly away and take a holiday and hide, actually right there in the middle of that turbulence and restriction, in the middle of COVID-fueled anxieties, God is still found. He is never shaken. He is reigning. He really is King Yahweh over all, and he will rain down judgment on the wicked. He detests lovers of violence. This Yahweh is the righteous one, verse 7, who loves justice. And every godly one, it says in the very last verse, will gaze upon his face. You are going to find him in COVID. You are going to gaze upon his face. I don't know what it's like in your house, but in our house and in our family, we long to gaze upon the needle. We really do. We're applying, scrolling through research options that might just give us the needle earlier, but actually, this poet wants us to focus our gaze elsewhere. The singing musician, shepherd boy in king's clothing with the warrior's staff and the spear in a time of maximum uncertainty and turbulence, knows that ultimately the answer of faith is that whatever that level of turbulence, however much the enemy might be throwing at us, Yahweh is never shaken. He is still found. He is reigning over all. He does closely watch. He does examine everything that's going on, and every godly one will gaze upon his face. Let me close out by reading verse 4 and verse 7 from the Passion Translation. Verse 4, yet Yahweh is never shaken. He is still found in his temple of holiness, reigning as King Yahweh over all. This Yahweh is the righteous one who loves justice, and every godly one will gaze upon his face. God bless you, keep you, and make his face shine upon you.